I would like to extend my deepest remorse to the family of the victim. He was a fellow musician. It really breaks my heart. And I wish I could take it back every day.
She walks into the courtroom as if she were a star, flipping her hair like she's back on the stages where she once shined. But in front of the judge, her career means nothing. And when she hears her sentence, she breaks down. This is the story of Samantha Grigg, and the crime she committed to end up here was as cruel as it was disturbing. To understand this story, we need to go back a bit. 6 months before being led into a Clinton County courtroom in handcuffs, Samantha Grigg should have been rehearsing for her high school graduation. She should have been choosing a dress, arguing with friends about the future, dreaming of bigger stages, record labels, and tours. Instead, her name would soon be spoken with caution, outrage, and disbelief, associated not with music, but with death. Samantha Grigg was 18 years old. She lived in Saline, Michigan. She was known as talented and charismatic, with a voice that stood out. She had been singing since she was young, led a local band, and performed at festivals. To many, she was the girl who was going to make it. To others, she was someone surrounded by the wrong people at the wrong time. To the justice system, she was someone at the center of a brutal crime that ended with a young man left naked and dying on the asphalt of a highway. The story begins on a cold February night. At 10:23 p.m. on February 15, 2014, a driver calls 911. He is traveling along I-69 near the East Lansing exit when he sees something impossible to ignore. A man lying in the middle of the road, unconscious and partially unclothed. It doesn't look like a typical hit and run. The body is positioned strangely. Something is far too wrong for this to be just an accident. When police arrive, they find the young man in severe respiratory distress. A nurse who happens to be passing by begins CPR while they wait for an ambulance. Every second matters. He is rushed to the hospital. Shortly afterward, he is pronounced dead. At that moment, it's not yet clear exactly what killed him. But the body tells a silent story. Abrasions consistent with impact against asphalt, signs of violence, missing clothing. The scene does not point to an accident. It points to something far more intentional. The question that arises is simple and disturbing. How does someone end up nearly naked, beaten, and abandoned on a highway? Hours later, the victim is identified. His name was Dustin Frolka. He was 19 years old. A student at Michigan State University, majoring in business, he dreamed of stability and of music. He was a rapper who went by the stage name Defro, and he believed he would eventually find his place in the world. But above all, Dustin was a father. A 10-month-old daughter, Melody, was waiting for him at home, unaware that she would never see him again. To his family, Dustin was someone trying to get back on his feet. He had made mistakes, yes. He used drugs, had gotten involved with dangerous people, and had even been arrested for possession. But he was trying, working, studying, raising a child. Like so many young people, he lived in that dangerous space between ambition and self-destruction. What he didn't know was that night, he would cross paths with people who had already decided to use him as a target. And this is where Samantha Grigg re-enters the story. The police investigation moves quickly. Dustin's phone reveals recent calls and messages exchanged just days before his death. One name appears repeatedly, then two, then three. Within a week, police identify 3 teenagers connected to Saline High School: Tyrell, 18 years old, Brendan, 16 years old, and Samantha Grigg, 18 years old. The shock is immediate. Samantha? The singer? The festival girl? The student about to graduate? The image doesn't match the scene on the highway. But phone records don't lie. They spoke. They met. They were together that night. When police knock on doors, the story begins to unravel. Tyrell is arrested at his apartment. Brendan and Samantha are found together inside a car, the same car investigators believe was used in the crime. Inside the vehicle, drugs, evidence, heavy silence. Samantha is taken in for questioning. At first, she cries. She says she never wanted any of this to happen, that she never intended to hurt anyone. But as the hours pass, contradictions begin to surface. And, pressed by the evidence, Samantha starts to talk. What she reveals is worse than any initial assumption. According to her own statement, that night she received a call from Brendan asking for a ride to East Lansing. The plan, she said, was to get something from Dustin. A robbery, money, drugs, something quick. She agreed. She didn't ask questions. She didn't say no. She didn't leave. She drove. Samantha takes the two of them to Dustin's apartment. She waits. Minutes later, she receives a message asking her to come back. They hadn't found enough money. Then comes the question that changes everything. Can you let him get in the car? Samantha says yes. At that moment, Dustin gets into the vehicle believing he was still safe. Maybe he thought it was just a ride, a favor, a negotiation. He was wrong. As Samantha drives, Brendan, wearing metal knuckle dusters, begins to beat him in the back seat. Inside the car, while it's moving, with no chance to defend himself. Desperate and injured, Dustin does the only thing that seems possible. He opens the door and jumps. At about 40 miles per hour, the impact doesn't kill him. Not yet. And this is where Samantha makes the decision that seals her fate. She brakes the car. She allows Brendan and Tyrell to get out. They go back to Dustin, now helpless on the asphalt. They beat him again, steal about $800, strip him of his clothes and shoes, leave him there, alone, in the dark, dying. Then they drive away. On the silent highway, Dustin is left behind. And with him, the last chance Melody would ever have to hear her father's voice again. But this story isn't over. Because while Samantha tries to present herself as someone dragged along by others, the justice system begins to dismantle each of her choices, one by one. When Samantha Grigg sat down in the interrogation room, the weight of the night of February 15th hadn't yet turned into headlines. There were no cameras, no audience, just a cold table, seasoned investigators, and a young woman who, just weeks earlier, had been singing about dreams, freedom, and the future. Now, everything she said had to answer one simple and devastating question. Why didn't she leave? At first, Samantha tried to frame herself as a bystander to her own disaster. Someone who didn't know how far it would go, who never imagined it would get this serious, who had only given a ride. But that narrative began to collapse quickly. Investigators weren't dealing with a naive teenager. They were dealing with someone who drove, waited, came back, braked, and left. Each step was a choice. The detectives knew it. And Samantha knew it too. The problem was that her story had to match the evidence. And the evidence was unforgiving. Call logs, messages exchanged before and after crime, the car's route, the timestamps, everything pointed to a deeper level of involvement than she was willing to publicly admit. That's when the word that would change the course of the case came up: a plea deal. Prosecutors laid out the real scenario. If Samantha were tried for felony murder, she could spend the rest of her life in prison without the possibility of parole. The image of a promising singer would disappear forever, replaced by that of a convicted killer. There was a way out. Samantha could plead guilty to reduced charges, involuntary manslaughter and unarmed robbery, in exchange for something essential: testifying against her own accomplices. It was an impossible decision for someone who still insisted on seeing herself as a victim of circumstance. But the system doesn't care about self-image. It cares about facts. And Samantha accepted. In the days that followed, she began recounting in cold detail everything that had happened that night. To investigators, the way she spoke stood out. It wasn't just the content, it was the tone. Too organized, too controlled, as if she were telling a rehearsed story. For the prosecution, that was useful. For Dustin's family, it was disturbing. As Samantha cooperated, Dustin's image grew stronger in the public eye. No longer just an anonymous highway victim, but a young father, a student trying to balance mistakes and responsibility, someone who had plans. His daughter, Melody, became a symbol of what had been taken that night. And the more Dustin's story gained humanity, the harder it became to accept Samantha's version of herself as someone who was pressured into it. She didn't just know about the robbery, she helped plan it. She didn't just witness the violence, she enabled it. She didn't just see the escape, she carried it out. When sentencing day arrived, the courtroom was packed. Family members, journalists, onlookers. Everyone wanted to see the face of the girl whose artistic life had been replaced by case numbers. Samantha entered the courtroom with her head down. Her hair fell over her face. Her hands trembled slightly. It was the perfect image of remorse, at least at first glance. When it was her turn to speak, she cried. She said she was sorry, that she never intended to hurt Dustin, that she thought about it every day, that he was a fellow musician, that it broke her heart. But for Dustin's family, those words healed nothing. His half-sister was one of the first to stand. Her voice didn't shake. Her pain had moved beyond shock. She didn't speak of hatred. She spoke of facts. She said Dustin's skull had been fractured multiple times, that he chose to jump from a car because he believed dying there was better than continuing to be beaten. She said Samantha not only failed to stop the crime, she stopped the car so it could continue. "You helped kill him," she said. "You took his clothes, his money, his dignity, but not his faith." Each word landed like a blow. Dustin's stepmother went even further. She began listing everything Samantha had stolen that could never be returned. Melody's first steps, her first words, birthdays, graduations, disappointments, achievements. "She will never know her father," she said, "because while we were in warm houses that night, Dustin was left to die in the cold." As those words echoed through the courtroom, Samantha didn't look up. At times, she nodded in agreement. To some, it looked like remorse. To others, it looked like nothing more than late acceptance of the inevitable. The prosecution asked for the maximum sentence allowed under the plea deal. The defense tried to revive the image of a talented girl with no serious criminal record, a victim of bad influences. They said Samantha had potential, that she would study music after prison, that she would help young people. To Dustin's family, that was almost insulting. He had plans too. He had a future too. When the judge finally spoke, the silence was absolute. He mentioned letters he had received, some asking for mercy, others demanding the harshest punishment. He said the case was not simple. There were no winners, only losses. The sentence came down like a clean cut, 6 to 15 years in prison. Samantha Grigg, the promising singer, would enter a prison when she should have been walking across a graduation stage. But if anyone thought the story ended there, they were mistaken. Because while Samantha cried at the defense table, the other two involved were still awaiting judgment. And what would be revealed in the cases of Tyrell, and especially Brendan, would completely change the public's perception of who truly controlled that night. As Samantha Grigg left the courthouse knowing exactly how many years of her youth would be consumed by bars and concrete, Dustin Frolka's case was far from over. For the family, her sentence did not bring closure. It represented only a fragment of the truth. Because two more names were tied to that night, and with them, an even more disturbing reality. Tyrell and Brendan, two young men, two different histories, united by the same decision to turn a robbery into an execution. Tyrell was no stranger to police. Quite the opposite. His name appeared repeatedly in reports, incidents, and court hearings. In just over a year, police had been called to his apartment 8 times. The pattern was always the same: minor crimes, assaults, probation violations. And every time, another chance. A judge believed he could still change. That belief would prove fatal. Months before Dustin's murder, Tyrell had already been convicted of breaking into a vehicle. The sentence: suspended. Then came an assault charge. Again, punishment was delayed. Even when there was an active arrest warrant for a probation violation, police went to his door, he refused to answer, and officers left. It wasn't serious enough to force entry. 3 days later, Dustin would be dead. To the victim's family, this sequence wasn't coincidence. It was institutional negligence. Every missed opportunity by the system had now turned into an unanswered question. What if? When Tyrell was finally brought to trial, there wasn't much left to deny. Faced with the evidence and Samantha's testimony, he did what the system encourages when conviction is inevitable. He took a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. In court, he admitted the plan to rob Dustin had been discussed days earlier. He admitted he knew violence was part of it. He admitted that when Dustin jumped from a moving car, there was no attempt to help. There was a return. There was another beating. There was theft. The sentence was severe, 25 to 38 years in prison. But one remained: Brendan. Only 16 at the time of the crime, Brendan was quickly no longer seen as an impulsive teenager. To prosecutors, he was something worse: the mastermind, the instigator, the one who didn't just participate, but drove the terror forward. It was Brendan who put on the metal knuckle dusters. It was Brendan who started the beating inside the car. It was Brendan who got out of the vehicle to continue the assault once Dustin was already on the ground. And it was Brendan who turned a robbery into something irreversible. Before trial, both Samantha and Tyrell agreed to testify against him. The prosecution was ready to expose every detail. Brendan understood that, and like the others, he chose a deal. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. In his statement, he described how it all began as a casual conversation on an ordinary night when robbing someone seemed like just another idea. He said drugs, influence, and environment all played a role. He said he didn't think about the consequences. He apologized to the family. But there was no longer room for apologies. The sentence reflected that: 32 and a half to 60 years in prison. When the gavel fell, the courtroom remained silent. There was no relief, only emotional exhaustion. 3 young lives destroyed, 1 child left without a father. And then came the inevitable question. Who truly was Samantha Grigg in this story? To some, she was the least violent. To others, she was the piece that allowed everything to happen. Without the car, without the waiting, without the braking, nothing would have unfolded the way it did. She didn't hold the weapon, but she held the steering wheel. And sometimes that is enough. The public became divided. Some believed 6 years was too little. Others said she would pay forever, even outside prison. The debate exploded on social media when old tweets resurfaced, including one in which Samantha talked about money just days after the crime. For Dustin's family, that sealed their perception of coldness. They didn't see a broken young woman. They saw someone who survived the crime, while Dustin never had that chance. The media began to highlight the cruel contrast. The girl who sang in court, the artist who dreamed of stages, now sitting as mothers and sisters, described a body left on a highway. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire story is this. Dustin Frolka's death was not the result of a single mistake. It was the accumulation of many. And while the 3 responsible parties received their sentences, life continued for those left behind. For Melody, for a family that now measures time in before and after. When the courtroom finally emptied, there was no sense of victory. No applause. No real relief. Only the sound of chairs scraping back, slow footsteps echoing down the hallway, and an uncomfortable certainty. Nothing decided there would bring Dustin Frolka back to life. For Samantha Grigg, that was the last day she entered a public building as an ordinary young woman. When she left in handcuffs, she was no longer the promising singer, the band leader, the teenager about to graduate. She officially became a number in Michigan's prison system. She was 18 years old when everything happened. She would enter prison before fully stepping into adulthood. For many, that seemed like punishment enough. For others, it wasn't nearly enough. Reports from inside the system suggest Samantha tried to keep a low profile. She avoided conflict. She didn't seek attention. Music, once her identity, became something distant, almost painful to remember. In letters sent to supporters and family, she wrote about guilt, sleepless nights, and delayed remorse. And the question that lingers is this. If Samantha had said no, would everything have been different? If someone had cared sooner, how many stories wouldn't have ended on that highway? There are no definitive answers. What remains is a record, the memory, the quiet warning this case leaves behind. Because stories like this don't begin with explicit violence. They begin with complicity, with the normalization of risk, with the dangerous belief that nothing that's serious will happen. Until it does. And when it does, no talent, youth, or promising future can erase the sound of a body hitting asphalt in the middle of the night, while a car drives away without looking back.